looking at COVID, what it was like to go through COVID. And I don't know, people have had varying degrees of experience with this, but for me, I went months without receiving communion. And it was obvious the effects of that, you know, or if I go through periods where I'm not praying as often as I should be, as what I commit myself to a level of prayer that I want to be maintaining, the effects are obvious. And I will point that out to people and they'll be like, no, it doesn't make a difference for me. And I'm just like, how is that not obvious? And I think part of the problem for some people is that, you know, if we're talking about virtue, whether it's theological or natural, there's a lot of nuances in virtue. We tend, I think when it comes to ethics, to be kind of big picture people, right? Where we're thinking of like the big ideal or the big standard that I want to uphold, and maybe a list of 10 commandments, but not a million commandments or not 100 commandments or anything like that. But the problem with virtue is that it's not the big decisions you make. It's not like, I'm going to be chaste, or I'm going to be hardworking, or I'm going to be wise. It's like, okay, fine. That's a good end to have in mind. But the means to that end is very subtle, very nuanced, and very, very hard to manage, right? So it's the small iterative decisions that you make in the meantime. Like, look at fitness is the best proof, I think, of virtue ethics, because it's empirically verifiable. Whereas other things, it's sort of like, oh yeah, that person has good character, but you can't really measure that, right? But with fitness, it's like, I want to be fit. I want to be healthy. I want to have a six pack. I want to get big arms, whatever the goal here is, right? It's like, okay, that's the goal. That's the end. You can't decide that tomorrow. It's like, tomorrow I'm going to have big biceps. No, you're not. Tomorrow you're going to do 3 sets of bicep curls and nothing's going to change about you. And if you want to maintain that goal, you would then have to do it again the next day. And then the next day. You have to multiply that small decision 1,000,000 times until it accumulates into the virtue that you want to build. Until you are fit, all of a sudden you just turn around and you're like, oh, how'd that happen? And unfortunately, vice happens the same way too. But vice happens by accident. And it's often out of neglect. Like, we don't choose to be bad people. We don't choose to be greedy or lustful or wrathful or any of these kinds of things, but they creep up on us because we're neglecting something that we shouldn't be neglecting. And so these subtle things can ensnare us and entrap us. And then the next thing we know, it's like usually what happens with vice is some big consequence will pronounce itself and we'll be like, how did this happen? Right? Like, maybe you've been growing in your character has been evolving in a certain way that is unattractive to your spouse or your significant other, and they're just sort of like, they can't be around you anymore, or relationships are starting to fall apart, or maybe you're addicted to something. Nobody says to themselves as a life goal, 5 years from now, I'm going to be addicted to porn, or I'm going to be addicted to drugs or alcohol, or just compulsively watching TV even,
Real
right?
quick, sorry, what happened with my phone? Why'd you take it?
I'm not logged in. You logged out of YouTube, so I can't get in.
Is everything okay there?
I mean, the chat's being annoying. I'm just trying to...
No, but is the stream's working?
Yeah, the stream's
Okay,
fine.
fine. I just got nervous. I love this point.
Yeah.
Because how many of us have said to ourselves, like, I'm going to get in shape?
Well, exactly. And then failed, right? Because we think of it as being maybe a 3-step kind of thing, but it's not. It's thousands of steps. And then you have to keep maintaining that until you get to a point where it just becomes second nature, where instead of like forcing yourself to get up and go to the gym, it's like you want to go to the gym because you now have this virtue and this discipline, right?
You not only know you should seek the good, but you want to.
Yeah. But on that journey, there's 1,000,000 side quests that you could go on that will distract you from that end goal.
Wow. Yeah.
You have to be diligent and you have to be persistent and consistent to actually get there. This is why virtue and good morals isn't a consequence of your emotions, because your emotions can never give you the consistency that your intellect and your will can if they're ordered together and if they're governing your emotions simultaneously. Now, this is stuff that none of us are exposed to in terms, like even in our catechesis, even like the church doesn't teach us these things most of the time. Like, it's there in church teaching. You have to go looking for it, but you're not going to hear this in a homily typically, at least where I live. You have to go read St. Thomas. You have to read, I mean, even contemporary somewhat contemporary writers like C.S. Lewis. I remember reading C.S. Lewis for the first time being like, oh, this is old stuff, right? Like, he was writing before I was even born. Like, this is like really old fashioned stuff. And he talks about the cardinal virtues. That was the first time I'd ever heard of those, like even just conceptually, let alone what they were. And then he talks about the theological virtues. And I was like, how do I learn more? But ultimately, for those who do want to learn more and go really deep into this stuff, I mean, this comes from Aristotle's virtue ethics, which the first time I read that was like, I'd been exposed. It's interesting how you get this a lot in the business world, like the motivational speaker types. There was a guy who was actually a pastor of an evangelical church that I used to go to, but he would talk more about this stuff because he was just really into like the motivational speaker circuit. And he would talk about that more in his sermons. And I was like, this is brilliant. This is really, really applicable and really good. And it's in a Christian context. So I kind of like that. And maybe it's related to God. I don't really know, but I want to be a good person and I want to be effective. I want to be all these things. And I remember later on, I asked him, I was like, this is after I had been exposed to Aristotle and I'd read the Nicomachean Ethics. And I was like, did you read Aristotle? Is that where you got this from? And he was like, no. And I was like, well, this is what you always used to say. And this is basically the virtue ethics. And he was like, yeah, you're right. I had no idea. So there's figments of it out there, but for the most part, we don't get exposed to it, but it's like, it's life-changing. You could build a really quality life on the Nicomachean Ethics without getting exposed to religion in the process. I mean, grace is the thing that people like me need to even make any success or any inroads in achieving virtue. But there's, we could have, if nothing else, if we just built our society on the Nicomachean Ethics, things would be a lot better.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's a lot more comprehensible, I think, than people think. You hear Aristotle, it sounds scary.
It's brilliant.
But it's actually more relatable than modern authors once you get past some of the jargon. And C.S. Lewis especially. I'm embarrassed to say that when I first picked up C.S. Lewis a few years after my conversion, I found it really hard.
So did I.
Yeah.
But I worked through it.
And not his academic stuff, but like mere Christianity I found hard.
Same.
And I was like, what does that say about how I was raised and what I've been conditioning myself to?
Well, and it's, how you were raised.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not so much your fault. Like I had graduated from high school by the time I read Mere Christianity, and I had no point of reference for how to think like this. I remember, and I read it the same way that I described earlier, where I'd read a page and I'd have to put it down and be like, whoa, I have to try and work through that. And then I'd read it again and be like, I think I get this. But even just the breadcrumbs that I was picking up were enough where I was like, this is life-changing and very, very profound. And that was my first exposure to anything philosophical. And by the way, for those of you who are wanting to get that kind of exposure, Mere Christianity is a great book to start with, because it was written to be lectures that he gave to the CBC or the BBC for radio, so like a mass audience, which just shows the level of sophistication of people back in the 40s, right?
To common people.
Yeah. But it's a great introduction to sort of philosophical thinking. And then you can kind of graduate onto his other books. I would recommend him to anybody.
Hey, thank you so much for watching. Before you go, do us a favor, leave a comment, let us know what you thought of the video, like, and subscribe.